Hello and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, the author of the novel Brotherless Night.
As you know, and has been frequently discussed on this channel, my youngest son plays soccer. His team lost in the district finals, and I'm going to refrain. Well,
Oh,
I'm going to say and then refrain from saying, like any soccer parent, it was on a terrible, terrible penalty kick call, giving the other team a goal on a non-foul. Um, but he's a sophomore, and I can't believe already a sophomore. I mean, he's going to be in college soon, and that made and I start thinking about my high school days and my yearbooks and those do you know those things that people wrote in like best at, most likely to do, like superlatives? I never called them this, but somebody told me they're called superlatives. Do you know this term?
yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Best this, best that.
Yeah.
Yeah, our high school had superlatives. My best friend from high school got who's a writer, Matthew Subramanian, got best smile, which was the thing I was most excited
Oh,
about. Did I bet you probably got some superlatives, most
I
likely
don't.
to mention their child in a soccer related manner on a podcast, most likely to go to an Ivy League school.
No, ours were all jokes, like most likely to fall down the stairs or get busted at a keg party or something like that. I don't think anybody ever wrote like serious ones. Yeah. Oh, the ones they actually put in the yearbook, I don't remember what those were. These are the ones that people wrote into your yearbook later. Um, anyway, I was thinking about that we've got all these guys. I feel like we have a lot of people who give themselves superlatives these days, including all the tech bros. We've already talked a lot about them on the podcast, but we're gonna talk to a guest who is an expert in these tech bros, and I wonder how many of them, like, what their superlatives were. You know, like most likely to become fascist oligarch, most likely to be most famous shit poster on X. I don't know. I don't know what those guys.
Most likely to be a
Actually, probably
huge
they were.
jackass.
Yes, they were. Actually, those are probably what were their superlatives, and that's how they turned out the way that they are, possibly.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how we can start out on one path and then end up somewhere totally different. And that's exactly what Jacob Silverman's new book, Gilded Rage, is about. It chronicles the trajectory of some of America's richest men and their conversion to far right wing politics. Jacob Silverman is an independent journalist in New York. He's the co author of the New York Times bestseller, Easy Money: Cryptocurrency, Casino Capitalism, and the Golden Age of Fraud, as well as the author of Terms of Service: Social Media and the Price of Constant Connection. Gilded Rage: Elon Musk and the Radicalization of Silicon Valley is his third book, out right now. Jacob, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Your title references the Gilded Age, as Sugi just pointed out. The historical period, like 1870 to 1900 or late 1890s. And I mean, people are familiar with what the Gilded Age is. There was industrialization, you had a high wealth concentration among a few people, and the parallels between that period of time and today have been mentioned frequently, but I'm wondering what the differences are between the two periods. Yes, there's a widening gap between the wealthy few and the everyone else who's working, but are we seeing like a repeat of history, or is this something different?
I think history rhymes maybe more than repeats, and there are some notable differences. I mean, and some things that I talk about in the book. Like, this is a group, today's oligarchs, that are less interested in creating any public institutions. We're not really seeing any universities or libraries created in the names of today's tech oligarchs. There is the occasional hospital, perhaps, and just sort of a political difference I think that's important is we're not really seeing confrontations with labor, perhaps in the ways that we might even like. Back in the late 19th and early 20th century, you had uh, early labor movement or anarchists in the streets fighting for things like the 8-hour workday or a 40-hour work week or basic labor rights. And right now, with some exceptions, there is sort of a real lull in labor activism, especially in the tech industry. So there are definitely some similarities. The level of resource accumulation and sheer greed, I think, in some ways outweighs what we might have seen in the 19th century.
Okay, so we've got the Gilded. Let's get to the Rage. In the book, you write that business is always political, and you trace the political arcs of a number of tech bro leaders, including Elon Musk, David Sachs, Peter Thiel, made their money at PayPal, then also Alex Karp and Gary Tan of Palantir. And some of these characters, like Peter Thiel, seem to have always had a rightward bent. We talked about this some episodes ago. We did an episode on South Africa. Um, and other folks like Elon Musk seem to have moved right, but they're all now, they seem to be on the same page. So what made them so mad?
Well, I think it depends in some individual cases who we're talking about, and I think you made a good distinction there that there are some of these folks were right wing to begin with, or kind of more dyed in the wool political animals. Someone like Peter Thiel or David Sachs, who were friends and co-writers together in college, have always been political and conservative in one way or another. I think one thing that changed is, first of all, these people got very rich and had all sort of the complications and also privileges that come with being a multi-billionaire, and also started encountering more conflicts with the state, especially the regulatory state, and that seemed to come to the fore during the Biden administration, when even small acts by the FTC or the Justice Department over antitrust issues provoked a pretty big backlash or a lot of fear and paranoia among some people in the industry. And another other currents that I trace
Lena
are
Khan, weren't they all mad about
yeah,
her?
yeah,
She
which
was the what was her position in the Biden administration?
she
She
was
I
the chair
forget.
of the FTC, and a lot of people
Okay.
think she was perhaps the most effective appointee of the Biden
She was
administration,
like
and
a
quite
legitimately antitrust person who legitimately pursued, breaking up or limiting the power of large companies. And that, of course, pissed off these guys.
Yeah, and notably, I think Lena Khan was not some socialist. She's an antitrust or market capitalist who wants to break up companies, prevent excessive concentration of economic power in order to yes, in the to mitigate their political power in the interest of fairness or economic justice, but also so that markets work better, and you can have more startups, more companies competing against one another, and better serve consumers. So but that even that kind of modest kind of center left type of government regulation was deemed intolerable by some of these guys. And we also saw, especially during the quarantine in early COVID days, some of them starting to have the same kind of crack ups that we might have seen from people in our own lives, but it's a little different when it's your friend or your uncle versus when it's a billionaire venture capitalist or CEO. And they did not take the restrictions and upheavals of the COVID years very well. And I'm talking not just about quarantine measures or what with which include things like Elon Musk having to shut down or at least temporarily shut down his factory in Fremont, California, but also things like Black Lives Matter and Me Too and some of the social and political movements of those years, and which kind of washed ashore in Silicon Valley, but really did not affect the industry that much. For example, we saw people like Andy Rubin, co-founder of or creator of Android at Google, have a number of sexual or have a number of harassment allegations against him, and he was essentially paid to go away, tens of millions of dollars. So, um, I think it's important to note that these kinds of political and social movements didn't really affect them that much, but they saw them through their phone screens, and they really did not like what they saw. And and that I think also motivated some of them to get more involved in politics and in don't putting their money where they could. But it also, I think, engendered this kind of paranoia that probably was facilitated by a lot of anxious group chats among them.
I remember the stories about Musk's being pissed off that his factory was closed. And then he ended up moving to like Texas. That was, I mean, I didn't realize that when I was listening to those stories, I was like, oh, this guy's just bitching and whining, that it was going to lead to him becoming such an influential figure on the wrong side of politics, in my personal view. So these guys, they didn't like being governed, and we're going to get to some of the
Yeah.
results of that, but they do like helping other people govern by controlling people through the surveillance state. And one of the reasons that you posit for this rightward shift for some of these companies and people is that they started making money by working with the Defense Department and working with other defense departments for other countries. In 2018, back when we thought of I don't know if we thought of, but Google seemed a more neutral type of company. The Google employees protested against this Project Maven that you write about, which was initiative using AI to help target airstrikes. They're like, we don't want to do this. It's not what we're here at Google to do. They canceled the project. The company did. But in 2024, when Google, or Alphabet now as it's called, employees protested the company's cloud computing contract with Israel, including the contract they had with Israel's Department of Defense during the country's attacks on Gaza, Google fired these people. Could you talk about this connections between these tech firms and the defense industry and how it's influenced their leaders?
Yeah, the book, is basically about the last 10 years, but I do try to place another marker after 9/11 and how the surveillance state grew and how the tech industry, mostly first by secret orders and kind of legal compulsion, cooperated with the Bush administration, but then really a cooperative and lucrative revolving door and mutual bond formed in the form of contracting and you know personnel going between high levels of government and Silicon Valley. And this was I think, a really important feature of the Obama years when a lot of the Bush administration war on terror and mass surveillance methods were really codified. And then um, now we're at this point where um, these companies don't, well, one, some of them are overtly ideological, like especially the ones that fall under the defense tech sphere, like Palantir or Anduril, but also others like Google just have seen the upside and also have this kind of apolitical stand that of course is political, but say like we don't want to be involved, we just want to do business, and so they're not willing to tolerate any political expression from their employees, and they saw it as a drag on business, I think, which in a way, in a crude sort of economic sense, it was. But yeah, the people who have been fired for protesting at Google or at other places like Microsoft have mostly been peaceful protesters, of course, who have, or silent ones who have done pretty much nothing to obstruct the company's business. But there's simply been such a shift either towards, like I said, overt ideology or just kind of that kind of corporate authoritarian structure where we want to do business for the government because it's legal and why not, that has no room for any kind of employee dissent anymore. And it's not just employee protests. It's, if you talk to the press, that all these companies pretty much have sort of internal threat monitoring systems where they're reading employees' emails or monitoring their systems to see what they're doing or what they're downloading or what they're taking screenshots of, and they're very serious about this. They're running their own surveillance states within these large corporations.
You mentioned earlier that in the prior Gilded Age, we saw lots of active, agitation for workers' rights. What about what about these tech workers? I mean, are we going to ever see them push back on this, or are they too fat and happy? I mean, they obviously make a lot more money than somebody working in a factory who wants to not have to work 70 hours a week or whatever.
Yeah, it's certainly different by that dynamic. I mean, it's some. I think we're seeing some signs of labor activism. I mean, there has been for years in terms of Tech for Palestine, some of these other smaller groups that have lobbied on specific issues, or climate groups within the tech industry trying to keep the big tech giants to their climate goals, which they're mostly abandoning for the sake of AI. But it's very difficult, both in terms of kind of executing this kind of coordination, like I said, when your employer is surveilling you, but also activating, I think, that kind of class consciousness. I think it is changing in the sense that a lot of rank and file employees, while they may be comfortable, they are not very happy about um, the military work of their employers. They might have a kind of corporatist bent, but they're not. Some of them think, doing work for the IDF or doing cloud computing for the IDF is not what I signed up for. And then also tech, while it's heavily male, it is diverse. And I wrote an article over the summer for Business Insider about Sean McGuire, who's this pretty right-wing venture capitalist at Sequoia, a very important firm in Silicon Valley, but a lot of who represents this kind of new jingoistic and very militaristic tech elite type. But at the same time, I talked to a number of Palestinian and Muslim tech employees, like rank and file type people, founders, people work in venture capital who are not happy with the kinds of things he's saying about Zohran Mamdani and Muslim politicians in the US or anyone else. And I think that reflects this growing fault line within tech, especially among um, Muslim employees, which there are many, but you don't have to be Muslim in tech to oppose, working for the Israeli government. But anyway, that is a major fault line there, and I think one that will have to be dealt with in one way or another, and I think could manifest as more protests. And there are protests that have been going on and attempts at whistleblowing at Microsoft. So I think that is also an interesting place to watch.
It's when I think about this, I think about like the protests that I remember. First of all, for those of our listeners who may not remember, like the Google motto used to be like "Don't be evil."
Yeah,
Um, that seems like so far in the rearview mirror. And then there was also this like spate of like AI related resignations. So there were these high visibility resignations where people were protesting ways things were going at Google, like Tinit Gebru or Hinton,
yeah.
or like people talking, but not sort of like the organized labor thing that you were talking about, which is like an interesting distinction to see it move from one to the other. I feel like would be this real shift that hasn't exactly happened yet.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. There have been plenty of high profile and very laudable people like Tini Gabriel you mentioned who have been unjustly treated very publicly, or we know about their firings. But the main kind of labor organization that's happened there, there is sort of a nascent alphabet workers union, but it has been on the lower levels of kind of security guards and cooks and people who occupying these kind of manual labor positions at taking care of tech campuses, or actually there. I mean, Microsoft I think also might be interesting because they have a large one of their video game divisions has a large union, but that's kind of the farthest they've scaled up the corporate ladder there.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about them as like de facto states. That's raises the level of creepiness a whole other level. To pivot a little bit here, and other ways that I think we're maybe failing to understand how the tech industry has shifted and is shifting. I think the American media has done a pretty bad job of reporting on the influence that Saudi Arabian wealth has had on the tech industry in the US. And you, however, have an excellent chapter outlining those connections. And I wonder if you could read to us about that.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Thank you. In the decades since the September 11th, 2001 attacks, corporate America welcomed huge infusions of capital from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf dictatorships. The UAE, with five sovereign wealth funds totaling more than $1.4 trillion in assets, became a player in everything from renewable energy to artificial intelligence to real estate. Saudi Arabia poured billions of dollars into American venture capital firms and tech startups through its public investment fund and Sanibel, the PIF's VC firm. Andreessen Horowitz and Founders Fund were among the most notable recipients of Saudi money, but they were just two names among hundreds. In 2016, Uber received an astonishing $3.5 billion from the PIF. The SoftBank Vision Fund, a massive investment fund that invested billions of dollars in companies like WeWork, Slack, and FTX, received about $45 billion. Blackstone's infrastructure fund got $20 billion. By fall 2018, the Wall Street Journal reported Saudi Arabia had become the single largest funding source for U.S. startups. The Saudi Silicon Valley relationship represented a convergence of shared interests. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, like other Gulf dictatorships, wanted to wash its money, diversify its investments, deepen influence with its most powerful ally, extend soft power, and counter its image as a repressive state responsible for a devastating war in Yemen. Silicon Valley offered all of that, along with access to cutting-edge technology and a business elite coming into its own. They're surveillance states, they're police states, said Nader Hashemi, a professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at Georgetown University. He continued, they want to use the latest technology in order to continue to remain in power and surveil their populations. So they have another interest in trying to sort of be the beneficiaries of high-tech developments, hoping that that will help them internally with their own political rule.
Thank you. Um, I just thought one thing, there are a couple things that were interesting about that part. One is that these connections with Saudi Arabia and tech investing go back beyond the Trump era. They go back in time. And also that that second part that you were talking about, that the Saudis viewed the tech stuff as a way to surveil people. Like it's part a way of it, like the Twitter they viewed as like they don't. You write about how they use Twitter as a way of keeping track of what their people are doing. I think there was a point in time when people thought that social media was going to be during the Arab Spring, a like device for like freedom and like ways to organize beneath government control. But it turns out actually this is like a Trojan horse, and that uh, governments are going to use social media to control people. Am I wrong in thinking that?
Yeah, it's kind of both, but also the governments are naturally more powerful. There are genuine ways I think in which social media has opened up space for public discourse and conversation and organization or networking, but governments tend, especially authoritarian ones or dictatorships, tend to be more powerful, and they've used social media very effectively to surveil and propagandize or harass and intimidate their population. And I think that's something that some people might know in the abstract, but I really tried with the example of Saudi Arabia to make this quite clear and to connect that investment in sort of diversifying the economy side and the politicking of all that with the authoritarian governance and surveillance, and using that same technology to arrest dissidents and disappear and kill people in the case of Saudi Arabia.
I mean, that's been happening in the United States. We now have I guess DHS or whoever is working on immigration, quote unquote, is looking at people's Facebook posts and deporting people based on those or questioning them at the border. And which brought me to, I mean, Musk is in the title of the book, and his acquisition of Twitter is written about, and it's an important event. And I remember people making fun of him for doing that. And it turns out to me that it has been a brilliant and incredibly smart move on his part to control the idea economy. It was incredible. It's been powerful. And he's made a lot of changes at X that you talk about, including like devaluing linked articles, which is something that I honestly didn't know. And now I'm going to change my Twitter practices. Maybe that's why nobody likes my Twitter posts. But it's given him and the way you write about the way that he is like internally, specifically at times when it pissed him off, like Biden had a tweet about the Eagles winning the Super Bowl that was more popular than his, and so he like made the engineers at Twitter, or I don't remember what Twitter or X then, change the algorithm so that his tweets would be liked more. Am I so? And not only him, but you referenced before Peter Thiel and David Sachs. They founded a publication called Stanford Review. They wrote a book called The Diversity Myth. They've been involved in like thinking about news and media, and a lot, even though Trump always talks about fake news and media's dying and all this sort of stuff. But these people are really aware of the power of media. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so to start with the latter part, Peter Thiel and David Sachs in college were co-writers and friends, and then they wrote a book together called The Diversity Myth, which grew out of their college writing, and I've read it. It's not a very enjoyable or comfortable read, but it could be published today with just it's this long book length rant about multiculturalism and campus politics that now
Yeah, I
is
should
just
say it came out in 95.
yeah, but you could do a control F now and just replace everything about multiculturalism with wokeism or identity politics, pretty much. Even Peter Thiel gives a lot of public speeches and interviews, and goes for someone who hates colleges. He goes to a lot of them and speaks to young Republican groups and stuff like that. And he's complaining about the same things he was complaining about in college. Like he has the same examples, like having to read a book by Rigoberta Menchú, who won the Nobel Prize for her indigenous activism in Guatemala in the late 1980s. He still uses that as an example. So, in a lot of ways, they haven't evolved that much, but they've just brought along other people with them, like their friend Elon.
Well, I just want to. I was talking about like I was talking about the way Musk has a change began by buying Twitter. He could actually he's
Yes,
amplified what he
the
wants to
media
amplify. I
platform
mean,
part.
these things are affected by the way the algorithm works, right? And you
Yeah,
can
so I
promote your
think
ideas that way.
I think you're right that when Musk was first buying Twitter, a lot of people thought he was kind of foolish. But and I mentioned in the book that in some ways actually reminded me, not that I was much of a media watcher at the time because it was many years ago, but when Robert Maxwell bought the Daily News, like this was sort of a distressed media asset that a highly leveraged billionaire was personally obsessed with. But of course, the difference is, I don't know if Robert Maxwell was a columnist or writing all the articles, but this was also a conduit for Musk to cultivate his own flock. And this is someone who has really benefited, at least in the past, from his online following and also, frankly, allegations of online stock manipulation or just the ability of Tesla to kind of become a meme stock on social media. So while he paid a lot and he had to be sued into consummating the deal, it actually turned out very well for him. Not only because, of course, it helped get Trump elected, but I think one thing that might be overlooked is that Twitter was sort of the signing editor of the media at that point. I mean, still is, of course, very influential in setting the news cycle, but even more so then. And by claiming that for himself, and this is someone who already had a huge media presence, of course, in Musk, and ability to set the news agenda. But now he was claiming that for himself, and as you mentioned, including when his tweets didn't get enough attention, directly interfering in the algorithm and what people were seeing. That was a major and perhaps unappreciated shift that had wide effects, I think, beyond the Twitter platform, or X platform, including, what other media outlets are writing about and focusing on, what other people are seeing on other platforms. So, um, while I think that raises an important point there that they are trying to dictate things sort of on this more granular level through platform management.
There were writers who became stars on the early Twitter that I can think of, like Roxane Gay, right? Who were left-leaning writers. Now, the people who are, I mean, people like Cat Turd are nationally known figures because, because of the way that right-wing figures are embraced and boosted by X posting.
Yeah, well, it's really become Musk's world. I can't justify why I'm still in it, but I am still on there. I mean, partly because I guess I write about a lot of these people, but the site, just like especially with Grok, has become a reflection of who he is and his worldview. And like I said, he sometimes intervene at the level of telling engineers what to do or what he wants out of the site. But it's pretty widely believed that over the summer, when Grok decided to christen himself or itself, excuse me, I don't mean to anthropomorphize it, but when it started calling itself Mecha Hitler and spilling out pretty lurid, Nazi rape fantasies about the CEO at the time, Linda Yaccarino, that this was probably a result of Musk meddling and certainly a result of trying to make this thing less woke. Which it's always a term I kind of use in scare quotes because of how conservatives use it, but um, you get that kind of dysfunction because this thing is trying to imitate Elon Musk and responding to his pretty wacky, I think, commands. And that is one of the disturbing parts about seeing this all laid bare, but it's also something revealing, I think, too, that we can see like the what I call the right wing radicalization playing out, that we can see who they talk to, that yeah, it's this ridiculous people like Cat Turd. It's also pretty overt Nazis in some cases and other people like that. So mostly it's disturbing, but I also like to point to how the kind of there is a little bit of transparency here, just in that I think we can see who these people are and see who they talk to and whose ideas they value, and that in itself should be pretty troubling.
I think that yeah, like kind of the decimation of net neutrality in some ways it is like it's hard to see, and this is this like very specific example of it where essentially like yeah, our version of Lex Luthor has like no limits on his pettiness, no limits on how megalomaniacal he's willing to be to kind of shift things in his direction. And I was talking earlier about like the notion of them having kind of de facto states, and you have this amazing section in the middle of the book about various imagined and attempted techno-utopias, places where like the normal rules of society can be suspended or maybe not applied at all. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think as Whitney referenced earlier in the talk here, that these people don't want to be governed, and they are glad to kind of exercise power through existing politicians and political structures, and that's partly what the book is about. But there is this other side to their politics, of course, which is the more libertarian exit side, which is a term that Peter Thiel and some others use, this desire to exit. And we've seen it manifest itself in anything from investments in cryptocurrencies to attempts to undermine regulation to just simply ignoring laws in some cases. But also in the development of what are called charter cities, which had some antecedents in things like seasteading when Peter Thiel was funding these floating communities that never seemed to appear. But charter cities are attempts to sort of hive off a real piece of land from usually from a country with poor sovereignty itself, and then establish basically a corporate fiefdom there, a startup community that is generally run like sort of a corporate dictatorship in some sense. And the desire mostly is to avoid taxes or to make money in ways that can't be done under the laws and regulations of the United States, and also increasingly to do medical studies, medical testing that can't be done in the US in the name of sort of efficiency and moving faster and developing things. You know, to I think a lot of people that sounds a little scary, but to the people in tech, it's somehow supposed to be, escaping the strictures of the United States, the things that the U.S. has done to hold back innovation also. And there are some very real examples of this already in motion. Probably the most prominent one is Prospera in Honduras, which is on this island called Roatan. There's some very good reporting from there about the conflicts with locals, but also right now there is basically a corporation that owns a chunk of that island and that has been building there and has some number of residents and that is trying to do this sort of no taxes, medical experimentation, innovation, free for all. But
Oh
I'll
my
kind
God,
of relate.
that sounds so terrible.
It does, but they seem very enthusiastic about it. I did relate a short
Hey,
sort
let's
of
make an island where we can do any medical experiment we want.
I relate a little anecdote in the book about I went to an evening at this thing called Sovereign House, which I think it's moved to a new location now, but it's in Lower Manhattan. It's sort of part of the Dimes Square area, and this is one of the kind of intellectual centers, if you call it that, of like right-wing tech conservatism. And I went there, and they did a bunch of presentations on various charter city movements. Most of them were a little more than Discord servers, but there was a guy there from Prospera. And, he doesn't say that, hey, the government in Honduras turned over. They don't like the deal that we made with the corrupt right-wing government before, and they're now trying to take it back from us. But that is actually what's going on there. But, a lot of them are sort of these juvenile and or just straight up misogynistic fantasies about, escaping the tyranny of daily corporate drudgery and somehow achieving greatness on a new frontier. And that's something that they seem to think is lacking in the US. And the reason why the US economy is lacking dynamism is that there's no new frontiers to settle. So that's what they're looking for. And I do devote a lot of time in the book to sort of an attempt at that, if not quite a name, but it's certainly Charter Cities people consider it one of their own, which is this project in Solano County, California, that's also been called California Forever. It's had a few different names, but where they have secretly bought up about 60,000 acres of land there and are trying to build a new city.
Speaking of California, the place where a lot of these guys are from is San Francisco. That's their home. And one of the reasons they're trying to build places like Solano is that these people are all fucking pissed at San Francisco. Boy, they really hate it for a place that they spend a lot of time in. And that role has their more local politics relationship with San Francisco, which is a very liberal city, has also been part of this rightward lean. I wondered if you could give us a little outline of how the tech bros have been interacting with the local politicians at home.
San Francisco is really kind of a test bed for some of the things we saw in the 2024 elections from uh, tech conservatives or tech right, especially someone like David Sachs, who over the last few years became very involved in recall politics in San Francisco. I mean, of course, there's a lot of discontent brewing among kind of moderate Democrats or disaffected Democrats in San Francisco. I mean, interestingly, the mayors of San Francisco haven't been, left wingers. It's been people like London Breed, who was a centrist basically, or centrist Democrat. But it became this place where they thought that progressive policies had ruined the city, to put it pretty glibly. And this started manifesting itself in first an attempted recall of, I think first came the school board, and then several members of the school board who they were seen as caring more about renaming schools and kind of identity politics issues than reopening schools during COVID. They also were changing the admission standards for a prestigious public high school there. And this became a big battle that had a lot of money poured into it, especially for uh, a school board race, and became kind of this repository of reactionary anger in San Francisco. And way out, in some ways way out of proportion to what was represented by that, what was actually at stake. And then they tried to recall Gavin Newsom, which was funny in a way because people like David Sachs had donated to Gavin Newsom, and then a year or two later were trying to recall him from office, and we're putting a lot of money towards that. But that just shows you how sort of transactional oligarchic politics works. And they weren't successful there. And then they were able to recall Chesa Boudin, who was the district attorney, who was a progressive reformist. And in the minds of a lot of people, especially during COVID, especially when there were some very horrific and public attacks on Asian Americans in San Francisco, and more, not necessarily more violent crime beyond that, but more property crime and kind of visible sort of social dysfunction, open air drug use, public homelessness. A lot of this stuff got blamed on Boudin and his progressive policies. He'd been in office for less than 2 years, but he was painted by the tech right, especially by Sachs, as the killer DA. That's what Sachs called him, as this, Soros funded DA who loved criminals, didn't care about crime victims, and pretty much it went from there. And they were very successful. And I think this was also an example of this far right element in tech allying itself with disillusioned Democrats and kind of centrists and, you might say, conservative Democrats in San Francisco, um, people like Gary Tan and others, and helping tug the institutions of San Francisco, like the DCCC, the governing institution for the Democratic Party there, to the right, with support from people like London Breed or Brooke Jenkins, who was Chesa Boudin's deputy, who famously resigned and denounced him, and then got his job after he was recalled. So, this was a very important test bed for them. I think it was also important for shaping their kind of social and political attitudes. As you mentioned, they are very angry and they don't really like people anymore. This is maybe a difference perhaps between, I don't know how much of a man of the people J.P. Morgan was, or Cornelius Vanderbilt, but there is a definite sort of antisocial, or even, and sometimes xenophobic element from people like Elon Musk. Like they don't like cities. They don't, which they see as kind of that, like conservatives before them, as sort of these uh, non-white urban centers that are unsafe, and don't they certainly lack a common touch, and they just, that anger and reactionary sentiment that's overflowing from them, I think, was initially channeled very much towards San Francisco, even the city that they saw as falling apart around them, even though it, of course, had been the engine of their wealth.
Jacob, thanks so much for joining us. We'll encourage our listeners to go out and check out your new book, Gilded Rage, at a local independent bookstore near you.
Thank you. Glad to do it.